Right. So the Jazz for many years ran, the Stockton Malone pick and roll was just a huge, that's what their entire team was. And you saw a little bit of this in 97, but you really saw it in 98. I don't know, for whatever reason, 98 is just the year that you saw this more. The thing that they exploited, they could take their two best players, put them on one side of the floor, put everyone else somewhere else, like not in the play whoever they wanted because of the illegal defense rule. That's how they were able to play Mark Eaton, Greg Ostertag, these stiffs at center. And you could not help early on that without outright switching. So that was the asymmetry that they exploited for years and years and years. Because every time you put in a pick and roll and you take three players out of the play and you make it 2-on-2, there's a moment where there's an opening, and Stockton Malone were just so good at it.
You were not allowed for this. We won't get into the depths of the archaic illegal defense, but essentially, you were not allowed to bring help defenders over in any kind of pre-rotation or anything like that if the offensive players were set over on one side of the court, and then there was another provision for being above the three-point arc. So that's how you would get these. You could do it in isolation. Charles Barkley, Mark Jackson, of course, had the back down that was finally outlawed at offensive 5 seconds. But in this two-man game, it was essentially illegal or impossible to bring people over, pre-double team off the ball. I think the only way you could do it is if you double teamed the ball. That was legal to bring an extra defender over. But otherwise, if it's the two-man game and you're sitting on the weak side, you literally had to wait until the ball came to you, until the action unfolded to help.
Right. Yeah. I mean, think about like kind of the overloading defense that Tom Thibodeau implemented on LeBron and how that just informs the whole concept of loading up to the ball. It was institutionally almost impossible to do that.
Yeah.
You had to be like so precise with how you timed it. But what the Bulls did and what the Bulls had was Scottie Pippen. And Scottie Pippen is one of the smartest, longest, just most incredible help defenders or man defenders, I mean, of all time. And so what they would do, and this is, I think, a precursor to, it's very much in line, I think, with, some of the roaming tactics you would see now where you put a big guy on the worst offensive player. What they decided was if they're going to, when Stockton and Malone sort of get into their pick and roll position on the side, what we're going to do is we're going to have Scottie Pippen guard not one of the guys on the perimeter. We're going to have him guard Greg Ostertag. We're going to have him guard Greg Foster. We're going to have him guard Antoine Carr. And so that way he can travel less of a distance to come help on the pick and roll than he would if he had to guard a normal matchup. So they would force the pick and roll down to the baseline as best they could, and they would bring Scottie over quickly off the big man that he was guarding, so you kind of run interference and just disrupt the timing of what they did. That was their approach instead of playing traditionally. And they also had Scottie trapping the ball at half court a lot to get out of John Stockton's hands. They took advantage of the fact that Greg Ostertag, Antoine Carr, these players, they were just non-threats. You could station them all the way out the three-point line, and Jerry Sloan sure tried to draw legal defense rules, but they were not threats to actually score from there. So at a certain point, they were going to always matriculate towards the basket. And that way, they kind of solved the numbers asymmetry that the Jazz have been exploiting. It instead of the pick and roll always being 2-on-2, now it could be 2-on-2.5 or 2-on-3. I mean, that's the beauty of the pick and roll is it takes a 2-on-2 and for a second it's a 2-on-1. So the Bulls, because Scottie was just so brilliant at how he timed his rotations, his anticipation, his ability to play man and ball, and of course the size of the Bulls elsewhere, so that they weren't yielding as much space. It really disrupted like the Jazz bread and butter. I mean, Karl Malone had a horrible series in that series. I mean, the Jazz scored 54 points in Game 3.
Yeah,
it was an absolute joke, and so that was a.
I think Malone actually ended up having the best of the bunch for Utah. Was Stockton?
Yeah, actually, that's right.
Yeah, Stockton got completely chipped away in that series. Keep going. You had more, though.
Yeah. I believe the Jazz were the number one offense in the league during the regular season. They scored, I think, something like 80-something points per 100 possessions in that series.
It was not a good look. Yeah.
No. So that was, I think, a precursor to, the battle of illegal defense. I mean, Jerry Sloan was lobbying for Pippen to be called for illegal defense the entire series.
Every possession. Yeah. I had actually forgotten about that specific dynamic. And so Pippen guards the opposing Jazz center the entire series, basically. They start this from the opening tip of game one. And what's funny is the Jazz had a rotating turnstile at center, right? Like it was, would you go to Ostertag? Would you go to Greg Foster for his jump shooting? Would you go to Antoine Carr for his post-isolation game, even though you lose a little defense? He was kind of considered an undersized center back then as well at like 6'9". He would have to guard Luke Longley or whatever it would be on the other end. Adam Keefe gets a start in one game. Yeah, I mean, it just keeps going and going. It didn't.
The funny thing is today what probably would have happened is you would have seen Karl Malone play the 5 and Shandon Anderson or Chris Morris play the 4.
Yep.
But that was just never a consideration.
Yeah, and so it reminds me of even like Draymond in 15 and 16. Just he's going to guard one of these opposing wings, whether it's Andre Roberson or who was it against Memphis? Tony Allen.
That was, Tony Allen.
Yeah, where it's just like, we are going to, and there was no illegal defense then, so he could overload, pre-rotate, load up to the ball. But it was the same idea where, for whatever reason, because you're so set in your ways, sports coaches and even in basketball, there's a conservatism about your experience. They didn't even think about taking one of the centers out and going small, which is extra ironic because those Bulls were kind of modern in that they would play Tony Kukoc at a stretch 5 or have Rodman be the 5 and play like Pippen, Harper. There's this great intro to Game 4 after all this talk that I sent you right before we recorded, where Bill Walton is basically describing the future of basketball, and he's like the Bulls are brilliant and Pippen is brilliant and the trapping and all this stuff, but what makes it hum is that no matter what's going on behind the play, you've got Jordan, Pippen, Rodman, and Harper, and they can all switch and do the exact same thing. And so one play that jumped out to me in rewatching this was I think it's early in Game 4 with all this talk about illegal defense, and those 3 players float to the weak side for Utah. And basically, Jim Gray has the report that none of the officials knew who any of the Bulls were guarding, but they all looked legal because it's like, well, if he's guarding that guy, that's okay. And, was it a zone where there's 3 guys on the weak side just saying, whoever comes into my space, I'm going to switch? This is the chaos before the illegal defense. Yeah, and now since then, it's cleaner. You just pre-rotate.
Right.
Thanks for listening. You can find the full episode of this Thinking Basketball podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts.
Scottie is capitalizing on Phil Jackson's brilliant matchup strategy. He's trapping and denying Stockton at midcourt, double-teaming anyone at his discretion, basically roaming like a football-free safety. Now, what makes Chicago's defense so effective is that 4 Bulls, Jordan, Pippen, Harper, and Rodman, are all totally interchangeable, able to switch on everything Utah tries. Utah still has 2 options, though. They can work harder, they can try to find some more energy, but realistically, I don't see anyone outworking Jordan and Pippen.